So Psalm 77, not a very long psalm. See what the Lord does. It might not be a very long study. There was no way I could go into the next psalm tonight because the next psalm's got 72 verses. So we'll probably be in that one for a bit. But 20 verses in this one tonight. So again, we see the address there in the first, and to the chief musician, as we see most of the time. And here to a man named Jeduthun, and we're told again that it's a psalm of Asaph, and this time we don't have to figure out, is it Asaph himself or someone that bears the name under his lineage? This is Asaph. This individual, Jeduthun, is also mentioned in the titles of Psalm 39 and in Psalm 62. And according to 1 Chronicles, chapter 16 and chapter 25, this man was one of the musicians appointed by David to lead Israel's public worship. So why Asaph addresses it to him, I don't know for sure. Maybe it was being written for his use. But let's jump into our first few verses. The psalmist writes, I cried out to God with my voice, and he gave ear to me. In the day of my trouble, I sought the Lord. My hand was stretched out in the night without ceasing. My soul refused to be comforted. I remembered God and was troubled. I complained, and my spirit was overwhelmed. Selah. So the psalmist, he says he cried out in the day of his trouble, and in the day of his trouble he sought the Lord. And without stopping, he stretched out his hand to the Lord throughout the night. So it's an intense picture that we kind of start off with, just a tormented man praying unceasingly through the night. We don't know what led to the torment, but we can certainly hear it in his language. And you wonder what would keep driving him. I mean, besides whatever the problem, whatever the crisis was. But I think reading his words here, we could say one of the driving forces was his soul refused to be comforted. It kept him going. It almost seems in the language that it put off the comfort it could have received. And again, I've mentioned this before. I'm just always drawn to the fact of the psalmists, and they speak about their soul, and they speak about their spirit. And I sometimes just think, and I've again said this before, that we lump ourselves as one thing, and we forget we're more than one thing, and that we relate to the Lord in each of those things. Yes, together, but each of those things. And I believe if God gave us each of those components of ourselves, then each one of those relationships is not only important, probably a little bit different. And it seems like the psalmists were always able to key in on what was interacting with God the most. And here the soul of this man was refusing, in a sense, the comfort that was coming. His soul was. And then what gave him the confidence even to continue to seek the Lord through the night? What enabled him to have an endurance for that? Well, I think it's something that he knew. And it's right there in the first verse. He cried out to God, and God gave his ear to him. I mean, he was in distress, there's no doubt. And yet he knew that if he cried out, that was one thing he was assured of, is that God would hear him. And those of us that are born again have that same guarantee. Now, at first, I think we're impressed by the psalmist, his diligence to pursue the Lord for help. But a deeper look reveals, I believe, the misdirection of his focus. He prays unceasingly, but he complains to the extent that comfort escapes him. His self-focus caused him to moan and groan instead of rejoicing. And there were moments when the light shined in, but his soul refused to be comforted. Now, maybe this is just my experience, but we can sometimes be stubborn in our pain. We can be stubborn in our troubles. And it can sometimes seem an insult to give up the struggle, to accept the help. I mean, letting go sometimes can seem like a surrender. It can seem like quitting almost. I thought a lot about that while I was studying. My wife can be a witness to this. When I was a younger man, I carried a lot of anger. And I can't even tell you most of the time what I was angry about. I was just angry. And there were times when I was carrying that anger that if someone dared tried to calm me down, it was insulting. No, this is my anger. It's my pain, it's my anger, it's my problem, it's mine, mine. And you can't have it. And sometimes I think we can be like that with God. We don't want to hand it over to him because there's some kind of power in holding on to it. Not realizing the freedom that's on the other side when we let it go. So the more the psalmist contemplated his situation, the more depressed he became. And the more he prayed and cried out, the more aware he became of the Lord listening to his prayers, but the more troubled he felt and his spirit became overwhelmed. And he knew God was present, but could not understand why he wouldn't help. And it can be frustrating to believe God hears us and yet our troubles remain. Now, the Apostle Paul dealt with that challenge. He talks about it in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 7 and 8. He says, "And lest I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of the revelations, a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I be exalted above measure. Concerning this thing, I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it might depart from me." And we know it didn't. But then Paul heard from the Lord, and he was able to change his perspective and find peace. Continuing on, 2 Corinthians 12:9, Jesus said to me, Paul speaking, said to me, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness." It seemed that's all Paul needed to be reminded of. As he goes on, he says, "Therefore, most gladly I will rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore, I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in needs, in persecutions, in distress for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong." So when asking help from the Lord, it's important to stay aware of what we're focusing on or whom we're focusing on. If we're crying out to God while putting ourselves first, we're focused on the wrong thing. Too much introspection is a bad thing. And when we consider this psalm in its entirety, we see this problem very clearly. In the first 10 verses, as we go along, you'll see the personal pronouns I, me, my, they're found over 20 times in those first 10 verses. And the names of God are found only 7 times. But when we get to verse 10, we're going to see a distinct change in the psalmist. In the last 10 verses, the personal pronouns are found only 3 times, and the nouns and pronouns referring to God are used over 20 times. So we see that switch of heart. Now, when we seek and accept the ministering of the Holy Spirit, he helps us to do away with that focus of I, me, my. And then the closing word of verse 3, it asks us to consider what we've discussed here. It's that word Selah that comes up in the Psalms. And we can see it as having a musical purpose because these are songs. And we know, if you know anything about music, if you read a little bit of music at all, there are times when we're to pause in the playing of an instrument, of a song. In this case, though, there's the other emphasis, and that's a pause to consider, a pause to meditate on something. And it's interesting because the root of the word Selah, the Hebrew root word, means to hang up, to weigh. And what a great picture, that we would stop and take what we've heard, take what we've learned, hang it up and weigh it to see what it means, what it's worth to us, how much is there. Let's look at verse 4. "You hold my eyelids open. I am so troubled that I cannot speak. I have considered the days of old, the years of ancient times. I call to remembrance my song in the night. I meditate within my heart, and my spirit makes diligent search." So the psalmist continues voicing his list of complaints, and it seems his trouble stole his ability to sleep. He blames what sounds like insomnia on the Lord, perhaps picturing him forcing his eyes to remain open, or maybe his eyes were just too weary from crying to close as he stared into the darkness. And he says he was unable to find words to express his anguish, which I think is funny because he's got plenty of words here. So in his attempt to find comfort, he turned his attention to what we might call the good old days. Ancient times when it appeared that God did answer the prayers more readily than he was doing at that present time. And he recalled nights when he was able to find comfort from music, and his meditations were comforting to his heart. I think it's a habit we all have in those times when we can't seem to find what we're looking for from the Lord. We're struggling to find comfort and peace. And a lot of times we go back. We think about what he's done in the past, which isn't a bad thing. It's just if we think that that last time was the only time, that's when it becomes a bad time. It needs to be an affirmation that he did it before. Why wouldn't he do it again? Let's pick up in verse 7. Will the Lord cast off forever? And will he be favorable no more? Has his mercy ceased forever? Has his promise failed forevermore? Has God forgotten to be gracious? Has he in anger shut up his tender mercies? Selah. So the psalmist sought comfort in remembering the good old days when things went smoothly with him. But the more he looked inside himself for victory, the more he doubted the compassion of the Lord. He was overcome by his doubts. His doubts led to questions. And each question was inspired by fear and unbelief. Listen to the questions. Will the Lord cast off forever? Will he be favorable no more? Has his mercy ceased forever? Has his promise failed forevermore? Has God forgotten to be gracious? Has his anger shut up his tender mercies? That first one, will the Lord cast off forever? So the psalmist thought that perhaps the Lord was finished with him for good. And he feared that never again would he see the favor of God, the mercy of God, and the fulfillment of God's promises. And the psalmist wondered if God's grace and mercy were no longer available to him. And if in his anger God had shut up his tender mercies. So wrestling with the voices in our head that stirs such doubt can be torturous. If you've been there, you know what I'm talking about. And here's the truth. The enemy loves to keep us there. He'll lead us there if we're willing to go with him. And he'll keep us there as long as we're willing to keep listening. But you know, what started as an exercise of fear and unbelief became proof that none of these things were true. The psalmist's faith was tested and then strengthened as he answered each question, because the answer to each question was no. None of those things were true. None of them were true of his relationship with the Lord. And once again, at the end of verse 9, we're encouraged to pause and meditate on these things. Selah. Now, you know, it's interesting. I often quote Mr. Spurgeon. And Mr. Spurgeon had some incredible relationship with the Psalms. He did a 20-year study of the Psalms from 1865 to 1885. Matter of fact, I just brought it in to show that that was the product of his 20 years. 150 Psalms. You know, the thing I love about Mr. Spurgeon, even though theologically I don't agree with him on certain things, but most things are just been written by him like no other. And he's one of the most prolific writers in history. Just volumes and volumes. He sometimes taught 5-6 times a week. Amongst his other ailments, he had an eye problem. He usually read his notes verbatim. Because of his eye problem, you wouldn't see him at the pulpit because he held it up in front of his face so he could see it. But during those 20 years that he wrote those studies, just to give you a little bit of an idea, he experienced much ill health, which continued to deteriorate until he died in 1892. And he had neuralgia and gout, which left him with swollen, red, painful limbs, so that he frequently could not walk or even write. He had debilitating headaches, and with these physical ills came frightful bouts of depression, leading almost to despair. There were times he spent weeks in bed because of his depression. And when you think about a man of God as great as he was, and that the fact that there are people that will say that a Christian can't be depressed, you know, the enemy would like to take you no other place than into a depression. Because really the better word is oppression. The enemy oppresses. Now, I want you to keep that in mind about what I just shared about Mr. Spurgeon. And consider that when I read what he wrote regarding this psalm. And you might think, I mean, that would be a psalm if you were living that kind of life that you might glom onto and identify with. And so Mr. Spurgeon wrote this. He said, "Alas, my God, the writer of this expedition well knows what thy servant Asaph meant. For his soul was familiar with the way of grief, deep glens and lonely caves of soul depressions. My spirit knows full well your awful glooms." So he was basically saying that he definitely could understand Asaph's writing, what he was going through, because he was there himself. And he goes on and says this. He says, "If you are a child of God, yet never had to ask these questions," the ones that we just read. "If you are a child of God, yet never had to ask these questions, you ought to be very grateful. But if you have to ask them, be thankful that Asaph asked them before you. And believe that as he had a comfortable answer to them, so shall you. It is always a comfort when you can see the footprints of another man in the mire and the slough. For if that man pass through unharmed, so may you. For his God shall also be your helper." Let's pick up with verse 10. "And I said, this is my anguish, but I will remember the year of the right hand of the Most High. I will remember the works of the Lord. Surely I will remember your wonders of old. I will also meditate on all your work and talk of your deeds." So in answering his own questions, the psalmist discovered a discrepancy between what he believed and what he felt. That discovery caused him anguish. That anguish led him to a determination. He determined to remember. In the midst of his anguish over what he believed and what he felt, he spoke to himself, declaring what he would do. He determined to remember something and to keep it in mind. And he would remember the years of the right hand of the Most High. He would remember the better seasons when God's power seemed unrestricted. And anytime we see a mention of God's right hand, that is talking about God's power. It was a time when the presence of God's strength was evident. And the psalmist would find his hope for the future in the recalling of better times in the past. Another thing Mr. Spurgeon said, he said, "It is our duty to search for comfort, and not in sullen indolence yet to despair." And so that tells me that we're not supposed to stand still when times are bad. We're not to stand still when we find ourselves maybe depressed or oppressed. We're to search for comfort. And those of us that know God have that in spades. We just need to search for it sometimes. Mr. Spurgeon also suggested that we borrow light from the altars of yesterday to light the gloom of today. And the psalmist further determined to meditate on what he remembered and to talk of God's deeds. That's why we spend a little bit of time on Sunday, just praising the Lord, sharing amongst ourselves what God's doing in our midst. And if there's nothing in your week, you can always just open a page of the Bible and look back at the great things he's done. Sometimes it seems like somebody else's story, but it's our story. We're written into this book. Look at verse 13. "Your way, O God, is in the sanctuary. Who is so great a God? Who is so great a God as our God? You are the God who does wonders. You've declared your strength among the people. You have with your arm redeemed your people, the sons of Jacob and Joseph. Selah." So the psalmist thinks of the remarkable and miraculous display of the strength of God that delivered the Hebrew people from the bondage of Egypt. That's even one of those. You say, well, that's their story. No, it's our story. That led to everything that we have. It led to the Savior coming to this earth. It led to us having this word that we're reading right now. And the truth is, as a believer, you had your own Egypt. You came out of your own Egypt. You were delivered from that darkness. So by this time in the psalm, the psalmist was in a good space spiritually. The personal pronouns have disappeared entirely from his vocabulary. Self-centeredness has given way to God-centeredness. He described God's good works as beginning in the sanctuary, and that would be either the sanctuary of the temple or the tabernacle. The way of God was in the sanctuary in the sense that the tabernacle or the temple and its rituals clearly spoke of the way of God through the blood of an innocent sacrifice, which ultimately what? Pointed to the person and work of the Messiah, Jesus. The psalmist spoke of the miraculous work that displayed the strength of God as he had done time and again in the history of his people. He says, "You are the God who does wonders. You have declared your strength among the people. You have with your arm redeemed your people." And they knew many times through their history, God's people saw his faithful strength rescue them from all kinds of trouble. And one more time, third time now, Selah, to stop and consider. And to give yourself adequate space to actually experience that, I would say, read the psalm again later. Give yourself time at those Selahs to consider what you've read. Verse 16, "The waters saw you, O God. The waters saw you, they were afraid. The depths also trembled. The clouds poured out water. The skies sent out a sound. Your arrows also flashed about. The voice of your thunder was in the whirlwind. The lightnings lit up the world. The earth trembled and shook. Your way was in the sea, your path in the great waters, and your footsteps were not known. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron." So the psalmist here pictures the waters of the Red Sea as if they looked up to their Creator only to retreat in terror. In nature, we see exploded in a violent storm, talks about torrents of rain pouring down, shattering crashes of thunder burst overhead, lightning flashed across the sky, lighting up the landscape. A furious whirlwind barraged the area, and the countryside shook under the fierce assault. Now that's interesting, because we all know the story of the crossing of the Red Sea as they fled from Egypt. But when we read this, the picture is not completely familiar to us. We're not told of a thunderstorm that accompanied the parting of the Red Sea. So the question becomes, did the psalmist include something here not included in Exodus chapter 14? Or is this just a poetic account of God's power and presence? Well, interestingly, and I didn't know this until this particular study, interestingly, we have a reason to take the psalmist's description as literal. It seems that the ancient Jewish historian Josephus did take it literal. Listen to what he wrote. "As soon as ever the whole Egyptian army was within it, the sea flowed to its own place and came down with a torrent raised by storms of wind and encompassed the Egyptians. Showers of rain also came down from the sky, and dreadful thunders and lightning with flashes of fire. Thunderbolts also were darted upon them, nor was there anything which used to be sent by God upon men as indications of his wrath, which did not happen at this time. For a dark and dismal night oppressed them, and thus did all these men perish, so that there was not one man left to be a messenger of this calamity to the rest of the Egyptians." Interesting. I had never read that account until this particular study. And so it seems that psalmist's picture was accurate, as long as Josephus was accurate. So I think that as we come to the end of the psalm, what a difference there must have been in the countenance of the psalmist when he reached the end of this psalm compared to where he was at the beginning. He closes by noting that God led his people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. So the psalm closes on a peaceful note, the shepherd God leading Israel through the wilderness to Canaan in the care of Moses and Aaron. I thought it was interesting, someone once noted, and I really think it fits here for this psalm, that occupation with self brings distress. Occupation with others brings discouragement. Occupation with Christ brings delight. And that's the journey that he was on through this psalm. And then I also found an interesting description of the flow of thought through this psalm. And the description used 4 words to describe it, divided it into 4 places. For verses 1 through 6, it said sighing. For verses 7 through 10, sinking. Verses 11 through 15, singing. And verses 16 through 20, soaring. And that really was the psalmist's journey. He sighed, he sunk, he sung, and he soared. Good description. So again, we'll stop there for tonight because the next one is much too long to get